We also got a question in on Spotify from me, Jim. I hope that's how you say it. Says, great episode. Would love to know your thoughts on how athletes should approach carb periodization. What do you think of tracking apps like Fuelin and Glycogo? Do you have any input on that?
Yeah, so this Yeah, well, this is with respect to the carbohydrates episode with Ator. Now, I haven't spoken to Ator about this, but I can certainly answer the question. If you look at the research, it's pretty supportive of carbohydrate periodization, which, for those not familiar, basically you bump carbs up in and around hard workouts and more carbohydrate usage, and then bump them down on days where you're using less carbs. Maybe easy activity or a gym session where you may need less carbs. So it's basically like matching your carbohydrate intake to your carbohydrate needs, right? And this is a pretty well established protocol. How low you go is a point of debate, but it's certainly something that happens. It happens in elite sport a lot because you just have to match those requirements. So, interestingly, a recent paper from Jeff Rothschild from New Zealand, he showed that athletes don't do this well at all. And that paper's like the last couple of weeks. So I didn't want to go through the whole paper, but you can certainly find it. This doesn't surprise me because I think, and this may be where you need to use an app, like people don't really understand how much carbohydrate they're intaking and how much they need. So I think that's part of where the value may be for these apps, be it short-term or long-term use, right? You might decide you want to do this long-term. You might decide, listen, I'm going to do this for 6 months to learn what I need to take in on a day, and learn what a high carb day looks like and a low carb day. I think this is best displayed to me when people talk about carb loading and go for a pasta dinner. Like that isn't carb loading. Carb loading's very intentional with a lot of carbohydrate. It's about 10 grams per kilo of body weight, or that ends up being about 5 grams of carbs per pound. That's so much carbohydrate. It's insane. Like it really is. Like, to give people insight, for the Boston Marathon, I tracked everything and wrote it all down, wrote an article on it for the company we used to work for. But I'd never forget eating a whole kilogram of pasta for lunch, which is
I
2.2
remember that.
pounds of pasta,
Yeah.
that was just lunch. So that's more than most people would eat for their carb loading dinner. So anyway, the point is, apps. I think there are tools, and all tools can be used and can be helpful, but then none of them are necessary and none of them are perfect. They're just one way of achieving it. I do think getting an idea of quantities is helpful for people, but there is a very important personality type thing here to be weary of. So, like, know yourself and know the risks of tracking things and whether it's going to help you. So there are some people where it will be triggering. There are some people who would be helpful. For someone like me, despite the fact that I love tech and data and apps, like that becomes a bit much for me because I am pretty obsessive. I will track everything. It becomes a bit much. What you find, certainly, and I've done bits of this, when you are tracking everything you eat, you start to question whether you should be eating that because you're like, oh, I don't want to track it. Right? Especially if you're weighing food, you're like, do I want to do this? So I remember the dietitians I went through university with, they had to track everything and weigh it with scales, everything they ate for a period of time. And they're like, I just stopped eating I'd skip bits because I'd be hungry, but I couldn't be bothered weighing it. And, that's a dangerous place to get to. So certainly the apps are helpful. Directionally, I think they're good. Remembering that calories are really hard to track. Like, it's really hard to get a good idea of calories, and because we don't have gas exchanges, so it's a pretty rough science in that respect. Certainly, grams of carbohydrates and intake is important, but we don't really know what you burn unless we're tracking it, and that's carbohydrates or anything else. So it's not to say these are wrong, but they're probably directionally correct, and then you have to tweak around them a little bit.
Again, let us know what you think. Do you use a tracking app? Would love your input. You can comment if you're listening on Spotify. You can DM us on 1% Better Pod on Instagram. You can email us. We do have an email in the show notes down below. We heard last week from a listener, Claire Petzel, who said she's a calcaneus fracture survivor, and they thought that she was a dancer or ballerina when they checked out. We didn't quite understand what she meant by that. And we said, Claire, if you're listening, reach out, explain to us. Well, she has done so. I almost didn't read out this comment when I found out she was an Arsenal supporter. So she's very, very lucky to get a mention on this podcast again. But this is what she said. It's Claire Petzel with the calcaneus. Firstly, massive fan of the pod, long time listener. The reason I said they thought I was a dancer / ballerina or builder wasn't to do with the shape of my foot, but more their questioning of how I got injured. Example, how did you do that? It's really hard for a runner to do, given it needs quite a lot of load / force. Usually we see it in ballet dancers who land badly on heels or builders who fall off ladders onto their heels. which is what made them investigate. And she says, shout out to her Dr. John at Fortuous as they figured something else was going on. Hence, coalition. Is it coalition? The coalition was discovered.
Yep.
She says, so it's fascinating, and thanks for talking about the different types. I'd never heard of it before, and I think I had the first one you mentioned, fibrous, but not entirely sure. There wasn't much they could do or recommend as I was functioning well with it. They told me to avoid red S and use insoles and do the regular rehab. Thanks.
So, how did you find out she was an arsehole supporter, mate?
She was DMing me on Instagram, so I saw on her Instagram profile. She messaged us on Instagram.
Okay, just creeping. Okay. I think that last little bit of that.
Wow.
I just think the last little bit of that was actually a question. Is like basically, is there anything else to do? And I think if that is a question, and she's functioning well, then I think there's not much to do. But if there is anything to do, it's really about the limitations. So basically, do what you need to do to keep moving, and certainly keep movement in the joints of the foot that aren't, that don't have the coalition. So generally, when you have a joint that's blocked for whatever reason, coalition or other, right, tight ankle joint or something like this, um, arthritis, etc., what you find is that the joints above and below have to compensate. So you do need to make sure that they're strong enough and keeping moving. So I would say to Claire, you need to make sure that that's one of the things. And then insoles, if they're helping, certainly. Otherwise, if you're functioning well, then that's great. And everyone should avoid red S. Like that's not a coalition thing. That's an everybody thing.
Right. We are supported by Nomio. We welcomed them onto the podcast last week. Why is Nomio good for me, David? What are the benefits?
Well, so there's health benefits that I certainly, again, wrote about in my newsletter that people could go listen to, or go read, even, that are around a lot of things to do with sulforaphane, so like brain health benefits and some anti-cancer type stuff that Nomio don't want to talk about and don't necessarily talk about themselves because they're more in the performance realm. When it comes to performance, they've got a couple of papers that that are available on their website that again are in that newsletter of mine, in the references. The articles at this stage or the research at this stage, firstly, is done by some of the researchers involved, and they were doing that prior to sort of being involved with the company, or launching the company. So the researchers launched the company and then employed people. So there is a little bit of bias there to be weary of, but the science does look pretty good. It is very early in the stages at this, in terms of what's showing. So at this stage, the one paper suggests that there's lower lactate levels for the same output, so a reduction in internal load with the same output. Now, again, you win no medals for lactate levels, right? But the question is, does that allow you to sustain better training, or do more training, or to get more work done, reduce the stress of the same training? So that's one interesting thought there. Perhaps changing the fuel substrate used, and again, that would change stress levels to some degree. The other study was probably more interesting. It looked at overreaching and basically gave people 7 days of high intensity intervals. So like a relatively easy way to overreach people. And it's always hard to do these things in a way that's both ecologically valid. So like what would happen in the real world where no athlete would do 7 days of intervals. Well, I mean, there's a couple guys that used to do it, but
No
these
one
days no one
should.
would do that. Yeah. So then you're trying to balance like how easy it is to get the research done and show something that's interesting versus how ecologically valid it is. So they looked at this. It is overload via high intensity intervals daily, basically. And what they found is that there was, when using Nomio daily, there was a reduction in nocturnal hypoglycemia, so low glucose overnight. And that can be important because it can wake you up from sleep and a bunch of other things like that. So it would be helpful to not have that. And again, this would fit for a different. This picture fits using a different fuel, right? Because if you're using more fat and less carbohydrates, you're going to have burn through less glycogen and therefore end up with less hypoglycemia. They also had less muscle soreness, and less symptoms of overtraining or overreaching at the stage. So it looks like perhaps there is like a hormetic effect of this, and that would again fit. These compounds are often mild toxins for protecting the plants, which then give us a benefit of activating pathways that help us to be more resilient. It's a phenomenon called hormesis, similar to like ice exposure, like cold baths and that sort of stuff. Exercise itself is a hormetic stressor. So it's an interesting field of research. I know I was speaking to the guys the other day. They've got a bunch of research there's a bunch of research being done that is going to be published relatively soon, and we'll keep talking about that on the podcast. But it's certainly, certainly promising. Again, as I said on the episode with Ator through the week, or in the prep for that, like there's a lot of smoke here. I've got a good feeling there's a bunch of fire, which is why I was willing to sort of proceed. But time will tell.
check out Nomeo if you are intrigued. We do have a direct link in the show notes down below. We would really appreciate that. I'm very intrigued for listeners to start using it and we see what results we get, and we'd love your feedback.